Okay, thanks everyone for being here today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Rachel Farrell, actually my the first PhD student measured by start date, and one of the greatest scholars I've had the pleasure to work with as a student and colleague. Her defense today is titled "Don't Give Me That Story: A Human-Centered Framework for Usable Narrative Planning."
So I'm going to start off with an introduction to the kinds of work that we do in the Narrative Intelligence Lab. So these are some systems that we've built. On the left, there's a VR training simulation for police officers, and on the right, there's an entertainment-based game that we call Camelot. In both of these, the non-player characters are controlled by an algorithm that's reasoning about the story as a whole. So not just what the characters are doing, but how the story is experienced from the perspective of the player. And it's trying to maximize some ultimate function. For example, the police training thing is trying to teach police officers specific behavior and penalize bad behavior. So to do these things, we use a technique called narrative planning, which is an approach to story generation. So why do we want to do story generation? Well, on the one hand, it's an interesting AI problem. People are very good at telling stories, but computers are not very good at telling them. We do it all the time without thinking about it, and yet it's hard to nail down an exact model of like what a story is and what a story isn't, or what's a good story and what's a bad story. For a more practical reason, human authors reach our cognitive limits when we're trying to write interactive stories. That's stories where the user can interact in a way that branches the story off in a different direction. So the more we do this, the more we allow branching points in our story, the story becomes more and more complex and more difficult to keep track of all these different branches. So we would like to be able to apply computational power so that we can generate more complex, more diverse branching stories. So there are a lot of approaches to story generation. For example, if you have a plot template like the hero's journey that describes how an overall plot is structured, you could just generate instantiations of these plot templates. But the problem is that plot template doesn't model every possible story, and there isn't one that models every possible story, so this is not a general solution. There are also other approaches that we can use to create new instances of stories based on similarities to previous stories, but they all rely on some sort of case base of existing stories that also doesn't reflect all stories in general. There are lots of machine learning based approaches to generating stories. The language models tend to be very good, so we can generate text that sounds really good, but it's hard to control the content of what comes out of these systems. They are able to introduce unexpected elements, which is a problem if we're like making a game and we have a fixed set of assets. We can't just introduce new kinds of entities into the story that we're not prepared for. And in general, these struggle to generate coherent stories. So even though they sound good when you read them, if you read them long enough, eventually you'll realize there's no underlying logic to make sure that the story makes sense. Another approach is to simulate the characters in the story as their own agents and just kind of watch what they do. So Tailspin did this in the 70s. They generated stories about little woodland creatures. For example, one day Joe Bear was famished. There was a jar of honey right next to him. He ate the honey at the end. So clearly it makes sense. It's a coherent story. It's just not very interesting. So simulation-based approaches struggle with authorial intent, that is generating stories that tell a specific story or have some story-like qualities that have any kind of message at all. So in response to this, there's a technique that we call centralized storytelling. This is where planning fits in. So instead of the characters being their own agents, we have one agent that controls all the characters like a puppet master. The characters just do whatever the storyteller tells them to do. This allows us to tell coherent stories and stories with authorial intent, but we struggle to generate stories with believable characters. So we have the opposite problem of the previous slide. So the characters, we need to make sure that they don't just act in service of the author's goal, but they actually seem like they're working towards achieving their own goals, even though they're not actually modeled that way. So planning in general works like this. It starts with a planning domain, which is written by a human, and it describes everything that's possible in the story world. So the planner starts with the initial state, which is a description of what all is true in the story initially. And then there are actions which can change the state of the world. So for example, this is the character Tom walks from the cottage to the crossroads. That is an action that can happen in the initial state because of some precondition, like the character Tom is at the cottage, and it has some effect that specifies what happens when it changes, when this action occurs, what changes in the world. So now he is like at the crossroads. So the planner can just build a tree of events that are possible from the initial state until it reaches a goal. And the goal is also specified by the author in the planning domain. So it's just a description of what constitutes an ending to the story. For example, we have a disjunctive goal that says there could be multiple possible endings, like Tom gets the potion that he wants and comes back home, or he dies in the process. So when we reach a goal, the path to get there is a solution. In other words, it's a story. So here's one story. Tom walks from the cottage to the crossroads, and then the bandit attacks him. If you don't think that story is very good, that's okay, because we could keep on searching for more solutions and build a tree of solutions called the solution space. And the solution space represents a branching story structure. Every path from the initial state to a goal is a story. Yes?
If Tom meets the bandit, is Tom automatically dead?
The way that action is modeled, the attack action, he doesn't meet him. This is attack. The bandit attacks him.
It'll attack always succeed.
In this limited version that I'm using for this presentation, yes.
Okay.
So the branching story structure of the solution space is useful because we can build interactive stories from it. So it's not automatically an interactive story, but it can be used as like an upper bound on what can be in an interactive story. So for example, we can let the user just choose every branching point, like make the choice every time there's a branching point. Or we could cast them as a specific character and allow them to choose only the actions of that character when that is available. And then we use some other method to choose the rest of the branches. And we can apply other kinds of intelligent printing techniques and so on to turn this into the exact interactive story that we're trying to design. So my main point is that the domain author needs to be able to evaluate the entire solution space in order to know if their domain is any good, if it's what they're wanting to make. So they need to do this for a couple of reasons: to make sure characters are believable, because like I said, that's our main problem with narrative planning systems. We always have to ensure that the characters are acting believably. So in many cases, it comes down to the author having to evaluate that themselves. And also just for general debugging, because it's super easy to make mistakes when you're writing a domain. And the only way to observe those mistakes is by evaluating your solution space. Okay, but it's tricky because here's what solution spaces actually look like. Hope that works on the Zoom, I'm not sure. So it's very long and very tedious. All these stories are very similar to each other, and reading that is painful because they're so similar, and you have to like slowly read it to carefully onboard like what the story is. And it's difficult to track whether characters are believable because you have to read it so carefully. And we have no tools to summarize solution spaces for authors. So really what we expect people to do now is write a domain and then read every single story that it can generate and evaluate it that way. So my plan with this work is to let people configure a domain and then help them understand the solution space with the summary tools that I will talk about in the upcoming slides. And then I want to test if those summary tools are helpful by quizzing them on whether specific stories are in their space or not. But first, my high-level contribution here is I want to improve the usability of narrative planning systems. And I do that in two major ways. So because on the first hand, the model needs to not make mistakes. So we need a narrative planning algorithm that produces stories that are generally good, that generally don't have characters acting unbelievably and doing things that don't make sense. So my first contribution improves the model in that way. But on the other hand, the author needs to not make mistakes, or at least needs to be able to evaluate their mistakes and fix them. And this, as I just mentioned, is currently highly impossible to do because you can't evaluate any significantly sized solution space. So I'm trying to contribute tools for summarizing solution spaces for authors. So first I will talk about the narrative planning model that we came up with to incorporate the beliefs of characters in the planning system. So classical planning, that is planning that's not specifically for narrative. In classical plans, an action is defined with just preconditions and effects. So for example, this give action where character 1 gives character 2 an item has a precondition where character 1 has the item and character 1 and 2 are both at the place. And it has the effect that character 2 has the item and character 1 no longer does. So this is how we model a character giving something to someone else. And in classical planning, any way to achieve the goal is a solution. So one solution is Tom walks to the market and then the merchant gives him the potion and then he walks home. But the problem is it doesn't make sense for the merchant to give him the potion because she's a merchant. She should want to sell it to him, not give it to him. This clearly doesn't have any benefit to the merchant. And so narrative planners before me came along and introduced the notion of intentionality into planning. So they added something to specify for each action, and that is the set of actors in the action. So in this action, we say that character one is responsible for taking this action, and giving an item to somebody else doesn't make sense unless there's a reason for character one to do it. And then we also define a goal for each character. So let's say Tom wants to have the potion and be back in his cottage, and the merchant just wants coins. So now the narrative planner must explain each action for each character in order for it to count as a solution. So we can now reject this solution where the merchant gives Tom the potion for no reason. And the way it does this is just it searches for a way to achieve that character's goal from starting with that action. If it can't find one, then it's not explained. It's the problem that we've revealed now by removing a bunch of bad stories from the solution space is more bad stories where this time characters seem omniscient. So for example, the merchant just walks to Tom's cottage and then he buys the potion from her there. It's possible and it makes sense for her a little bit because it can help her achieve her goal of getting coins. But we, as the author, we kind of want the merchant to stay at the market, like she doesn't know that he's over there wanting to buy stuff from her. We don't want her to just act so forwardly. And if that's not a very good example, another easier example is like there's a guard in the market who watches for criminal activity and arrests people if they commit a crime. But if you commit a crime somewhere else outside of the market, you expect him to not know that you did that. So you don't want to see him running out of the market, coming and arresting you because he shouldn't know that you committed a crime. So characters before our model were omniscient. So we introduced this model where for each action, we define an observation function that says for any character, whether or not they observe this action. So for this, we've said a character observes the give action if they're at the same location that this event happens. And that allows the planner to track at every moment in the story what each character believes. And we also allow the author to specify any initial wrong beliefs that any characters have. So let's say the merchant now believes that Tom is nowhere. So she doesn't think that he's at the cottage, therefore she can't imagine a plan to walk to his cottage and then sell him something. So that plan now doesn't count as an explanation for her. And as a result, this solution is no longer a solution. So our planner forces actions to be explained, not just in terms of the character's goals, but also given their beliefs. So we also track nested beliefs. So we don't just model what a character believes about the world, we model what they believe about each other character's beliefs about the world, including their beliefs about other characters' beliefs about other characters' beliefs, and so on. We don't have to go into all that detail of like tracking all those things, but the model can track them if they're used. So we tested whether it tracks nested beliefs accurately. We tested nested beliefs up to 2 layers. We did this on a mechanical Turk study, and we found that it was accurate in 3 different domains. We also showed that our model improves character believability. We did this by sampling character plans from different spaces modeled by previous planning models and showing people like 2 plans for a character, and we asked which plan is more believable for this character or makes more sense for the character to be considering. And we found that our model does produce more believable plans. So we've improved character believability by handling the omniscience problem and removing the stories from the solution space where characters act omnisciently. In doing this, we also allow interesting kinds of interactions that weren't enabled by previous planners, like anticipation and deception. So characters can act based on what they expect other characters to do, and they can also intentionally deceive each other and so forth. So this is great. This allows us to tell new kinds of stories, but it also allows new kinds of weird behavior that's hard to track down, because if the explanation for a character's behavior is they expected somebody to expect something and then they did something, that kind of thing is really hard to keep track of and foresee as the author. So you need to be able to evaluate your space a little bit more intelligently in order to track down stuff like that. So moving forward, I want to help domain authors identify bugs and strange behavior by providing a high-level overview of the story clusters. So I want to cluster the solution space and show them at a high level what types of stories there are, and also tools to explore the space more intelligently. So like clicking on those clusters and sampling those particular parts of the space so that they can look for specific stories. But in order to cluster stories, what I need is a meaningful measurement of story similarity. And what I mean by meaningful is there are lots of plan distance metrics. There are metrics for measuring syntactic differences between different plans, but those do not capture the semantic, meaningful differences between stories. So it's very possible to have two stories that are syntactically very similar, but have a different semantic meaning when you read the story. So I'm looking for a measurement of story similarity that's based on human perception of stories. So that leads me to the question, what do we know about how humans perceive stories? So I did some research, and it seems like people are generally in agreement that we produce situation models in our head, which are like mental models of the current situation. And we do that when we're perceiving reality as well as when we're perceiving stories. So there's one particular model called the event indexing situation model, which has been used in previous narrative planning research. And it defines 5 dimensions of events: protagonist, time, space, causality, and intentionality. In other words, who is involved in the event, where it takes place, when it takes place, how it's enabled, like what causal relationships it has to previous events, and why it's happening. So what are the motivations of the people who are involved in the event? So according to this model, previous events are easier to remember if they share any dimension with the current situation. So the fact that you're in this room right now means it's more easy for you to remember previous things that happened to you in this room than it would normally be, because this is the location of your current situation model. So Indexter is the first system that mapped these 5 dimensions onto narrative planning events. And they did that to measure the salience of past events based on the current events. They just had a numeric value of previous events, how salient they are in memory.
Yes. Developed for game narratives or for something completely
this was developed, I think, just as a tool for interactive narratives to measure things, things the player is likely to remember and things like that. So there's a later study that I thought was very interesting where they studied choice meaningfulness, and they found that when people in an interactive story are making a choice between 2 events, if those events differ along at least one of these dimensions, it's a more meaningful choice. It feels more meaningful to them, just based on, they rated it at the end and said, like, I find this to be more meaningful, as opposed to choices that didn't lead to anything substantially different. So if you've ever done the Netflix Bandersnatch thing, one of your choices is between 2 cereals, and it has no effect on any of these different dimensions of the situation model, meaning it didn't feel very meaningful. And I agree with that. Personally, I thought that was a silly choice. So this is a series of studies that I did for my master's thesis, where we tried to predict people's choices for the ending of a story based on this model. So long story short, what we found was that readers preferred endings that reminded them of their previous meaningful choices, where I'm using the definition from the previous slide of meaningful. So if earlier in the story they had made a choice that separated that led to 2 different events, they had chosen one, so it's like they chose one character or one location or something, then if the ending shared that dimension, if the ending was like using that character or using that location, they would be more likely to choose that ending. So this was a lot, but my main point is I think that there's a connection. So the choices they made earlier are connected to the endings. There's something about the whole story. So readers, I think, find stories to be meaningfully different when the stories differ along these 5 dimensions in some way. So that's what I'm trying to measure with my distance metric. So my approach is to track the salience of each entity in the story throughout the story in a numeric vector. So whereas Indexter was tracking the salience of previous events, I'm tracking the salience of entities, meaning like characters, locations, timeframes, and so on. So the things that establish those connections. So I track how salient like each character and stuff is throughout the story, and at the end I've got a vector that gives me a summary of like how fresh in the memory all of these entities in the story are. And I think that that will serve as a summary of the story. And then I can compare stories just by comparing the 2 vectors. So I begin with Indexter's definition of all these all the indices. So the question I'm trying to answer for each one is, what entity becomes salient, and under what circumstances does the entity become salient when this event occurs? So here's our example event: the bandit robs Tom of his coin at the crossroads on day 1. So when that event happens, through the space dimension, the crossroads becomes salient. So Indexter maps this dimension to the typed parameters in the event that are of type location. So just the locations from the parameters that become salient. And then time is handled the same way. We get the time frame parameters and they become salient. The causality dimension is mapped to the event itself and all causal ancestors of it. So an example of a causal ancestor of this event is the earlier one where Tom walked to the crossroads. I know that because I wrote the domain, and the only way for him to get Rod to the crossroads is he had to walk there at some point. So if there are any other causal ancestors, they would also become salient at this point. So in the protagonist dimension, the actors in the event become salient. And finally, in the intentionality dimension, the character goals that are used by the planner to explain the event become salient. So in this case, the planner had to explain this action for the bandit. And to do that, it used the bandit's goal to have Tom's coin. That's why this event happened. So I now have a finite list of entities in the story that I can use that reflect any story in the domain. And that is all the characters, all the time frames, all the locations, all the character goals, and all the ground events. So notice the ground events are going to be many more. There are going to be a whole lot of those in that vector, and that's fine. So I'll now do an example of tracking the salience of each entity in two different stories and then comparing them to each other. So the first story is the one we saw earlier, where Tom walks to the crossroads and then gets attacked by the bandit. The second one, he waits for night first, then he walks to the crossroads at night and gets attacked by the bandit at night. So I chose these because they're very similar, and yet they don't have any identical action signatures. So the bandit attacking him in the day is a different event from attacking him at night. So a lot of plan distance metrics would consider these to be completely different stories. They have no overlap. But I think that the true distance value should be close to 0 because they're very similar, just not identical. So the first story begins with this event. So when this event happens, we set certain entities' salience to 1. Those are the entities involved in this event. So Tom, the day, the cottage, the crossroads, Tom's goal, and event 1. I'm just calling that event 1, that's event 2, and then 3, 4, 5. So when the next thing happens, so anything that's not involved gets decayed. Here I'm using a decay value of 0.5. So Tom is not involved in the next event, so his value decays, he's at 0.5, but the bandit is now salient. So day is salient, cottage decayed, crossroads salient, Tom's goal is decayed, the bandit's salient, and both of these events are salient because the earlier one is a causal ancestor of the later one. So that's it for that story. Now we do the second story. Tom waits, Tom, day, cottage, Tom's goal, and event 3 are salient. Then he walks, and so we decayed day, and nighttime is now salient, and those things are still salient. The bandit attacks him at night, and so we decayed day again. That's down to a 4th. And Tom is decayed, cottage decayed, Tom's goal decayed, and those things remain salient.
What are the ground events again?
Ground events are the complete action signature. So like attack, bandit, Tom, crossroads, night. That's a ground event.
Oh,
Right.
so attack is not. So I bet you had attack in both places, but it doesn't show up as the same.
Well, it's 2 different attacks. So we have
Okay.
attack, this parameter and that parameter being different methods. So they're not identical actions unless they have all the same parameters.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Same function, different parameters.
Yeah. Okay, so now we have 2 vectors, one for each story. So this is the final vector from each story, and we compare them using a distance function. So we compare each component individually and then sum them all up with a weighted sum. So NSE stands for normalized squared Euclidean distance, which is a mathematical function. And then we get a value between 0 and 1 for each component. And you can see here, we've got 3 components that are identical. So these stories are identical in terms of their characters, locations, and goals, but they differ in terms of their time and causality. And the stronger one is time. That just checks out with my intuition. So I think this is good. It's good that this metric gives us like incremental information too. So not just a whole distance value at the end, but also the vectors are useful because they can point to where the differences come from. So we assigned a weight coefficient to each one of these. By default, we're going to assume they're all equally weighted, and we sum them all up and get the distance value. And it is indeed closer to 0 than 1, so that matches my intuition. Okay, so the whole point was to get a distance measurement that is based on perception, so that we're measuring what humans find similar and different about stories, so that we can use it to cluster the solution space in a way that provides a meaningful summary. So I use hierarchical clustering, which starts with a distance matrix. So for every story in the solution space, I calculate the distance to every other story and put it in a matrix. Now we assign every point initially to its own cluster, and then repeatedly merge the two nearest clusters until they've all merged into one cluster, and then plot the height of their merges, and that gives us a dendrogram. The dendrogram is useful because you can divide it into any number of clusters. So k equals 2, there's 2 clusters. You can do k equals 3, 3 clusters, 4 clusters, and so on. This is already kind of a useful tool because we can allow people to sample the solution space by just clicking on one cluster and like read example stories from different clusters. And that could allow them to at least avoid reading some like very, very similar stories, so they could use their time more effectively. But I want to do better than that. I want to label these clusters so that people can see with a quick glance what kinds of stories exist. So my goal is to find a story entity that's highly salient in the cluster that I'm labeling and not so salient in the rest of the story. So an entity that strongly defines that cluster. So I do this in 2 different ways. Method 1 is I cut the dendrogram into some number of clusters and just label each cluster. And then method 2 is to label the branching points on the dendrogram. So for method 1, I determine the optimal k. I use the silhouette method, but there are many other methods, and then cut the dendrogram. And then I get the set of vectors for the stories that are in the cluster, that's V, and then I get the set of vectors for all the stories not in the cluster, so V complement. And then I'm looking for the feature F, which is a story entity or a column in the vector that has the highest difference between its average salience in V and its average salience not in V. So the first term is average salience in the cluster, second term is the average salience in the other stories not in the cluster. I want the difference between those to be high, so I find the argmax F. Yes.
Why is it subtracting the average in the stories not in the cluster rather than this average over all stories?
Because I want it to be, I want to find a feature that is specifically present in the cluster and not present in the other stories. I don't want to over-include that one. So if I find the feature that maximizes this function, I propose that's a good label for that cluster. When I'm labeling the dendrogram, though, I can't use the full set of not V because I'm labeling it specifically versus its sibling. I want to identify this cluster by what separates it from its sibling cluster specifically. So let's call that N and N prime. And I also want to consider the 2 children of N. So I want a label for N that's evenly balanced, or at least not totally unbalanced between its 2 children. And the reason for that is just because of the labeling algorithm. I want to save that good label for the child because it makes more sense for the child than it does for the parent. So here's my function. On the left, it's the same as the function for the previous slide. That's saying something that is strongly defining N from N prime. And on the right, I've got the absolute value of the distance between the children, and I subtract that from the main value. So I want that to be small. I want the distance between N and N prime to be high, the distance between the children to be low, and I weigh it by some coefficient B, which is 0.25, just saying that the second term is less important than the first term. It's more important that it defines N than it is to be evenly balanced between the children. So I label it starting at the root. Each node labels its 2 children and then recurses on both of them. And I don't repeat a feature once I've already used it. And I also impose a threshold on this value here. So if the value is less than 0.5, I just say there is no good label, don't label it. And then the one thing I could do if there is no good label, but if the sibling has a label already, then I can use the inverse of the sibling's label. So if I've already labeled my sibling like the bandit, then I know that the bandit is salient in that cluster, but not salient in me, so it's safe to call me the not bandit cluster. So I used GraphViz to produce 2 different kinds of graphs. Circle graphs are labeled circles with their size varied based on the number of stories in the cluster. And then for method 2, I did tree graphs, which are the labeled dendrogram. But the thing is, if you just slap labels on a dendrogram, you're going to get labels overlapping lines. And then if you spread them out so that they fit, you're going to get a scrollable image. And I wanted it to be like stuck on the screen where they didn't have to scroll. So it's squished to fit on the screen readably, but height information is lost. Hierarchical information is there, but the height from the dendrogram is lost. Okay, so here are some examples. This is my circle graph. It's the biggest cluster is Tom walking to his cottage in the day is important. So in 45% of the stories, this action was chosen as the feature that represents them. He walks back to his cottage in the day because he's won, like he's gone and gotten his potion, he comes back and that's his winning action. So this is a cluster of stories where Tom wins in that canonical way. And this one is nighttime is important. So another way to win in this domain is to steal the potion from the merchant at her house that night. So this is stories where he waits for night and goes to get the potion that way. In this one, the bandit wanting Tom's coin is important. So this time a goal was chosen as the feature. And this is stories where the bandit acts in some way towards his goal of getting Tom's coin. In this one, the guard wanting to arrest Tom is important. So that's interesting because the guard doesn't initially want to arrest Tom. So this means these are stories where Tom has committed some kind of crime. And then here, Tom waiting for night at the market is important. So this one initially made me question whether it was being clustered right, because it seems like these should be in the nighttime cluster. Like why is waiting for night at the market so different from being from nighttime? And I assure you there's a good answer to this question, but I'm going to come back to it at a later slide. So here is the tree graph of the same space. So the red things are where I've labeled it using the inverse of the sibling. So the first split is between 26% of the stories where nighttime is important and 74% where nighttime is not so important. There wasn't a good label for that cluster overall, though. So this is the 45% cluster where Tom walks to his cottage in the day and wins. And these are the other clusters that were chosen as like the optimal clusters, according to my optimal K. So as you can see, this it gives us more information about how these clusters are related to each other than the circle graph does. And also gives us more breakdown, though it's kind of a lot to look at. So for example, the guard wanting to arrest Tom, that cluster breaks down into these two. The bigger one is Tom robs the potion from the merchant at the market. That's kind of what I expected. That's the main crime for him to commit right there. But also there's this cluster where the bandit attacks the merchant at the market. So the bandit is already a criminal, but he attacks the merchant, thus allowing Tom to steal the potion from her body. That's interesting. The tree diagrams show as much information as possible, while the circle graphs try to show just as much as is necessary, without being so overwhelming to look at. Okay, so that is what I propose to do. I will now discuss the evaluations of these two things. So the first evaluation tests whether humans agree with the distance metric or not, and the second one tests whether the visualizations are actually helpful for people authoring domains. So first, do humans agree with the distance metric? So I used the same domain because I want to make sure that I get results on agreement with the distance metric in this domain, because I'm going to use that for the second evaluation. So I'm randomly sampling triplets of solutions from the 58 set of solutions. And I asked the question, which one is more similar to the reference one, A or B? I did this on a prolific survey, so we got something like this. So by this point, the person has read a description of the domain, and then they've read this reference story that remains the same for them throughout the task. And they answer a bunch of questions comparing different A's and B's, and they answer which one is more similar to the reference. So they just pick A or B. They don't have the ability to say that they're equal. They have to pick one. So I want to use just the questions where people agree on the correct answer. So I had 8 people answer each comparison question. And so agreement is if at least 7 out of 8 gave the same answer, which happened for 37 questions out of 64. And this is interesting. It just kind of points out how similar the stories in the solution space are. Only 58% of A's had an agreed upon answer, meaning if you randomly sample the solution space, you're going to get a lot of similar stories. So then we compare, so using the correct answer given by humans, I compare it to my salience distance metric by looking at the matrix. I compare A and ref, the distance between A and ref, and the distance between B and ref, and I see which one is smaller, and that's the one that my distance metric answers. And so if that's the same answer that humans gave, I get a point. If it's not the same answer, I don't get a point. And if my answer is undefined because these two values are equal, I also don't get a point because the humans agreed that there is an answer. So we were successful. We got 34 out of 37 correct. The salience distance metric does agree with humans on similarity comparisons, at least in this domain. And we wanted to then further compare this to other distance metrics. So here are some planned distance metrics I alluded to before. Action Jacquard uses, so X and Y are the sets of actions in the different stories or plans. And so this just compares the overlap of identical actions. So the two that I did an example of would have a distance of 1 because they had no identical actions. Ice of distance is based on action distance, but it's built specifically for stories. So instead of using the full sets of actions in each story, it used subsets of actions that are meant to capture causality on the one hand and intentionality on the other hand. But it's still comparing complete action signatures, so it still suffers from the same limitation that Action Jacquard does. And then there's edit distance, which is the minimum number of edits that it takes to convert one plan into another, where an edit is an insertion, deletion, or substitution. And this can be applied at different levels of granularity. Yes?
What's the computational complexity of finding the edit distance?
I don't know, but I can answer that, just not at this exact moment. But it's, we'll answer that later.
Actually, these are on fixed vectors, so it's basically the Hammond distance.
We still concerned about that, or can we move on? We can talk about that at the end if you want. So we can do this at the action level where we're moving around actions, replacing actions with other actions and so forth, or at the symbol level, which is more complex, where you're moving around parameters of actions and the name of the actions. So those are the individual symbols. And then we can also do this at the word level using the translated version of the stories. So the versions that we showed to humans were just translations of the plan. So if we use the text, we can apply edit distance at the word level. Excuse me. So this is how we scored. We got 34 out of 37. I wanted to compare whether we did significantly better or worse than other metrics. So I did the z-test of 2 proportions, which tells me that 34 out of 37 is significantly better than 28 out of 37. So I've drawn the line at 28. Anything that comes below that, we did significantly better than that metric. So this is how the plan distance metrics stacked up. Edit symbol did the best, but we still beat them by 1 point. And the 3 that did worst are the 3 that are relying on action signatures. So Action Jacquard, edit at the action level, and ice of distance. Those all did not do very well. So I also wanted to try some text-based distance metrics where we use those translated versions of the plans that we showed to humans and do some NLP metrics. So blue is a method for evaluating generated text by comparing it to human written references. So we use that to measure the co-occurrence of n-grams. An n-gram is just a set of some number of words in a row, where n is that number of words. So we're measuring the co-occurrence of n-grams between the reference story and the 2 targets and getting whichever one is closer as the answer, and then comparing it the same way that we compared ours. And we tried lots of different combinations, and we plot the best and the worst. So the best was 33 and the worst was 31. Worst, most of them tied for best. The worst one was just using unigrams or only unigrams and trigrams. Rouge is like blue, but different. We tried lots of different versions of Rouge, and Rouge actually, the best one did a couple points better than us. That was using Rouge 3, 4, and 5. So just having higher ends is gonna do better. And then the worst Rouge did 31, same as the worst blue. So then we also tried a method using BERT, which is a transformer language model. We fed the stories into BERT, and then BERT maps them in a latent space. So we extract the position of the stories in latent space and measure the cosine distance between the 2 positions for the 2 stories and use that as the distance metric. So we tried an unmodified instance of BERT as well as trained instances. So in this case, we're training BERT as if we want it to generate more stories like this one. So we just use our same data set, train it as if it's going to generate more. And then after 1 to 5 epochs, we use that version of BERT, and we plot the best and the worst. So the best was the one that we had trained for only 1 epoch, and it scored the same as us, 34. And then the worst was 31. So, okay, that's it for the other metrics. I'm now talking about the parameters of my metric. I wanted to try, see if we could get higher values by changing some of these parameters. So our decay constant has been 0.5. Every time something is not salient, it gets decayed by a factor of 0.5. But what about all the values between 0.05 and 0.95? So it turns out the best version does do as well as Rouge. We got 36 if we set D to anywhere below or equal to 0.25. So that means decaying faster. And then the worst is 0.95, which didn't do significantly worse. So that's good news. We can tweak this parameter for a particular domain if you want to. I think that the reason that faster does better has to do with how long the stories are. So maybe if we're scaling it up, we would want to use a higher value. I think it's possibly just because of how short the stories are. So we also tried different index weights instead of weighing them all equally. What if we tried all these different combinations where they sum to 1? We tried a whole lot of combinations. And the best did manage to get all 37 questions correctly, which is encouraging, but of course it's not really fair because we don't know what the optimal weights are going to be. But it's interesting to learn. And so in this case, it was weighing time very low that helped us out. So according to the people, time was not very important in this domain. And then conversely, when we weigh time very high and everything else very low, it does very, very poorly. So watch out when we mess with the weights, I guess. We also tried several variations of the index definitions. There's a lot of detail about that in the paper. This is like where I've defined when a character becomes salient, when a goal becomes salient, and so forth. There are different versions of those definitions that we could use, and so I tried all the different combinations of those different definitions, and they didn't do significantly better or worse. We did manage to get 1 point higher than our default score, and the worst was lined up with everything else that was the worst, 31. The point of this was just to make the point that like this metric can be used with other storytelling systems, that it's not strictly reliant on these exact definitions that we put here. So another narrative planner that's not ours or another system that's like this can still try to use this metric as long as they can approximate that same information. We also did a totally different evaluation, or a different kind of analysis with the same data, and we got mostly similar results. Lots of stuff about that in the paper too. So salience distance metric agrees with human assessments of story similarity. It outperformed almost all the other metrics we tried, and some of them significantly. And importantly, unlike the other metrics, ours can explain its measurements in terms of story semantics. So testing whether the visualizations are actually helpful for domain authors. The ideal methodology here is we would let people write their own domain and then summarize their domain in real time. But we can't actually do that because we can't train enough people to write domains. It's a hard task. We were doing this during the pandemic, so we couldn't like bring people in and train them. And also it's just too slow to generate the whole solution space in real time, particularly when people are allowed to like write the domain as big as they want. That would be infeasible. So instead, we ask people to configure an existing domain that we've built, and we've pre-computed summaries for all of the different possible configurations of the domain. And so we just show them the one that corresponds to whichever configuration they're currently considering. And then we test their knowledge of the final configuration that they've picked by asking them questions about whether specific stories are possible or not. So we have 3 different groups. The control group gets no summary tool. The trees get a summary tool using the tree diagram, and the circles using the circle diagram. And both of these tools, the nodes are clickable. So when you click on a node, it samples a random story from that cluster. And the control group just gets the story box with the button that samples the whole space. So you start out with the storytelling robot, and he introduces himself and says he's trying to configure a story world and needs your help, like because he's only got 5 lines. He's got to get stories that fit on his little 5-line screen. And he explains the little tiny story world. It's the Tom world. And then he asks them 8 questions to configure the remaining aspects of the world. So we varied 1 belief, 2 preconditions, 2 effects, an observation function, and 2 goals. For example, the belief is whether or not the bandit initially knows about Tom's coin. And then one of the goals is like whether the merchant is willing to commit crimes or not. So they had all these different things that they can configure about the story world. And depending on their group, they would then get to explore the space of stories using one of these tools. So for example, here's the circle graph that we saw earlier. Remember this cluster, which was labeled Tom waiting for night at the market is important. And we wondered, why is that not the same as the nighttime cluster? So now they can click on this and sample stories in that cluster. So for example, Tom walks to the market, the bandit walks to the mansion, Tom buys the potion from the merchant using his coin, and Tom waits for night, and later that night Tom walks home. Okay, so he waits for night at the market, but right at the end after he's already gotten his potion and then just walks home. So here's another one. Walks to the market, buys the potion, the guard arrests the bandit, waits for night, walks home. Another one, something, waits for night, walks home. So these are stories where he waits for night right at the end after getting his potion in the more normal way, like the daytime way instead of the nighttime way, and then he walks home right at the end. So that's why it's different from the nighttime cluster. But importantly, this cluster draws attention to a possible believability problem, which is what it was designed to do. Just because the narrative planner thinks it's okay to have him wait for night right at the end just to walk home in a different way, the author may not think that that's a very good story, may not expect that to happen. For example, I am the author of it and didn't expect that to happen, so I just wasn't thinking about it. So this is doing what it was designed to do. Great. So the user can then configure these different things as much as they want. So let's say we want to allow the merchant to commit crimes now. We get another summary. Now we have new bubbles where the merchant attacking Tom at the market is important, or the merchant walking to Tom's cottage is important. So we let them configure the domain however long they want. And then we reach the point where we're going to ask them questions like, is this story possible in the world you configured? So also, we allow them at this point when they're answering questions to continue to use the tools so they can hunt down these stories that we ask them about and try to find them. So we selected 14 stories to ask about. Here's my justification for why we picked those. We had 8 configuration options. I wanted them all to be used. Like a story is only possible if a certain configuration is set a certain way. So I wanted all the configurations to be used. I wanted both values of them, true and false, to be used if possible. And I wanted to vary the number of configuration dependencies that a story has, because I think that the number of configuration affects how difficult the question is. So this is the spread. I erred on the side of fewer configuration dependencies because I think that the more dependencies it has, the easier it is to rule out the story, because there are more ways that you can remember based on the choices you picked for the configuration. There are more ways for you to realize it wouldn't be possible. So thus it would be an easier question to answer. So we did this study on Prolific, and we didn't force people to use these tools, and therefore many of them chose not to use the tools. So they all read the description of the domain, and they all answered the configuration questions, but then they could just move on to answering our questions after that. So they've configured the domain and they didn't sample the story space or read that many stories because we didn't force them to. So we did offer them a reward. There's like a 50%. If they got 50% or more of the questions right, we gave them a bonus, and we gave them a higher bonus if they got 90% or more right. And we told them that up front. So we hoped people would be motivated to understand the story world and answer these questions. Real domain authors would of course be highly engaged in exploring the space. So I classify the user's engagement level based on how much they interacted with the page and try to get results specifically for the people who were highly engaged with using the tools. And so these are the factors that I use to determine whether they were highly engaged. The total number of stories that they saw and the total number of configuration changes that they made. So times they clicked on a toggle. The threshold is mean plus 1 standard deviation. So if you were high on either one of these factors, then you get classified as highly engaged. So first, let's look at the results for all the participants before I did this filtering. As you can see, there is not a significant difference between the 3 groups. The one on the left is control, middle is trees, and then the third one is circles. So across the board, the average was around 60%. So this is about how difficult these questions were if you just remembered what you had configured. Like you did answer those questions, for example, the merchant can't commit crimes. So if she blatantly commits a crime in the story, you can answer that one correctly. But anyway, these are pretty difficult if you're not fully engaged with using these tools. So among the highly engaged participants, we did see a significant effect. Both of the experimental groups were significantly more accurate in answering these questions than the control group when we're just looking at the people who were actually using the tools.
So the one in red, actually, one that did not use it actually got worse.
Yeah. So well, no, these aren't. Yes. The ones that had no tool to summarize it, being engaged was bad. It lowered their accuracy. So the control group was much better at answering these questions if they were just guessing. But if they were trying to use the control tool to actually explore the space, they got confused and were worse at answering these questions. So another interesting thing that we measured was we asked them their confidence when they answered each question. So like on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you that your answer is correct? So confidence was lower for both experimental groups than the control. So it's the Dunning-Kruger effect. The control group was overly confident because they were so ignorant about the space. They had no feedback to tell them that their answer might be wrong, and they had explored so little of the space that they didn't realize how much nuance it contains and how complex this thing could be. And then we also asked a qualitative survey at the end where they're rating their agreement with statements like the questions were easy to answer, trying to assess basically how much they thought they understood the space, which is sort of the same as the competence questions, but it's at the end of the study, and it's measured a slightly different way. So we had mixed results on this one. The trees group rated this study this survey lower than control, which is matching the confidence data. So the people who saw the big trees understood how complex the space was. They were like, I've not seen an example of every story that's possible. They realized that the questions weren't easy and so forth. So they had a lower result than the control. But the circles group, I thought this was really interesting, like was higher than the control when we look at all the participants. So not just the people who are highly engaged, but just the people who like answered the survey and went through, answered the configuration questions and like just like looked at some of the summaries. So I think they're not clicking on a lot of them, but these summaries still help people understand what different types of stories are possible. So it does the job of like communicating something at a high level without them having to explore it in depth. So people in the circles group thought they had a better understanding of the solution space at the end than the control group did. So key takeaways are that those tools help people understand the content of the solution space as measured by their accuracy in answering whether stories are possible or not. And they also both helped people understand the complexity of the solution space. The circles did a better job of communicating that information quickly, whereas the trees did a better job of like helping people understand just how complex the solution space is. So my contributions toward the usability of narrative planning systems are first, the model of belief that improves character believability by removing bad stories from the solution space. And it also allows new kinds of character interactions that are fun and cool, but it makes debugging harder because it's harder to predict how this model is going to result in stories. So that underscores the need for my second contribution, which is the measurement of story distance that allows us to summarize solution spaces meaningfully for human domain authors. So I've now reached the point where I discuss everything else beyond this work exactly. The main limitation is speed. Generating the whole solution space is still a very slow step. But speed ups are a hot topic for future work. So one clear thing that we can do is develop new heuristics that account for the beliefs that our model has added that made the thing clunkier. So in the past, intentional planning was also very slow, and then Glaive came along and introduced a heuristic that accounts for the goals of characters and thus sped it all back up again. So the same thing can happen here. If we develop a new heuristic that incorporates beliefs in some way, we can probably speed up search quite a lot. There are also ongoing explorations into different search strategies that may be helpful for speeding up the planner. We've also explored using salience to speed up the planner. In this case, we tried using it as a step cost function. The idea being that solutions are more likely to not jump around so much between different locations and characters and things like that, as opposed to non-solutions. So a solution would be more likely to be one that was like internally consistent. There's a master's thesis that I believe was just passed today on using a technique called novelty pruning to speed up the planner. And also there's a possibility that we don't need to generate the whole space to build these trees, like use the distance metric within the planner to sort of do a diverse sampling thing and try to find the parts of the space that are significantly different from what we've seen before in order to like generate this summary tree really quickly. I think that would be very cool. There's future work that we can do on improving character believability in lots of different ways. In the paper, I talk a lot about plan efficiency because, for example, you know, if the planner finds a two-step plan and a one-step plan, they can both explain the actions. The character doesn't have to choose the more efficient plan. They can choose the longer plan because that's fine. We don't want to force characters to be perfectly rational, so we want to allow any plan that makes sense to be able to explain their action. Some work has been done on using personality and emotion models to sort of answer this problem or a related problem, like improving character believability by having specific character models for different types of characters. That's one way it could be improved. And it could also answer the question about choosing some plans over another. If we have a personality model that says this person is very rational and they would never choose this extra long plan, that might make sense if we only apply it to certain characters. We don't want to apply it across the board to everyone. Our model also does not represent uncertainty. We force every character to be certain about the state of the world at all times. They can't believe that two worlds are equally possible. And there is definitely space efficiency reasons for not doing that. But it also means that there are some stories that we can't tell. And it would be nice if we could sort of approximate uncertainty or in some way enable the system to tell those kinds of stories. We can also use this kind of work for belief and goal recognition, which is like the inverse of a planning problem. So we're trying to observe the actions that an agent has taken and infer their beliefs and goals rather than starting with the beliefs and goals and generating the actions. And we've done this. This is useful in like robotics as well as intelligence analysis. So that's some other kind of cool stuff we can do. We can improve the distance metric by possibly representing space and time hierarchically as they are in memory. Right now, the domains that we have are so small that this kind of is not really important to try yet, but maybe when we scale up and have bigger domains, there might be a use for that. The way we reflect intentionality is limited by the way the planner models intentionality. As I was saying, it just picks the first explanation it finds. But the first explanation the planner finds for a character's action is not necessarily the one the reader thinks of. So when you see somebody take an action, you might think some other explanation. So if we could better reflect like what explanation is most likely to come to mind, that would be more accurate. And then there's also a possibility of measuring causality in a totally different way. There's more on that in the paper. And there are other applications for salience distance besides clustering. For example, solution diversity is a common measurement of how diverse a solution set is overall. This is used either to compare different domains or to compare planning features and models and so forth. And I think if they used salience distance instead of plan distance metrics, they would get better measurements for stuff like that. Experience managers also use distance measurements to compare different trajectories through an ongoing interactive story. They could use salience distance. Player modeling, like measuring what kinds of things the player is likely to remember from the past or what they're likely to expect from the future. We could also use it to measure story quality or coherence or other specific narrative features. In particular, I think it's cool that like outliers from this clustering have unique properties. So maybe we could just look at outliers and say those are the most interesting stories. In conclusion, this work improves explainability and trust. We're trying to allow people to generate stories that are so big that they can't read and understand every single story on their own. They need to rely on the algorithm to do what it says it's going to do, as well as communicate what it has done. So we are closer than ever to deploying narrative planning systems in real world scenarios outside of these little in-lab prototypes. So I'm very excited to see where it goes next.